Hi, everyone. Thank you, Yvonne and Sean, for having me again. I'm really happy to be here and to kind of be a part of this discussion and see, obviously, what the next steps are given the current circumstances we're in. So, from the last discussion that I attended, we talked kind of like overarching in terms of trends and patterns we've seen across the sector. So, as you know or may know, ONN did a flash survey at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic when the shutdown was happening, just to get an idea of what the temperature was in terms of what's happening in the sector, how are nonprofits being impacted by the shutdown and the COVID-19 pandemic, and seeing and trying to figure out what the role of government would be in supporting the sector as we were all going through this pandemic. So what we saw are like, for example, when we did the survey report, childcare became a really big issue. Uh, I think social enterprises also talking about that, like social enterprises, social procurement organizations were impacted. We've obviously seen kind of the impacts on elder care and community care services and how that kind of has collapsed in some way over the last few months. Mostly we saw overall like that the interlocking social infrastructure is very fragile and I kind of like to use a metaphor. Things were bubbling at the bottom like a volcano, and now they've kind of just exploded. And we're seeing all of this kind of rise to the top. So those are some of the big ones and patterns we've seen. Also, just in terms of organizational management, we're seeing nonprofits pivoting, working online, and that's having an impact, as well as trying to manage staff, layoff, furloughs, what that looks like, having funds from the government to support nonprofits, particularly for nonprofits who are deemed essential services, such as things like the pandemic pay. Is that coming in? Has that come in for some organizations? And just generally kind of the question around how are nonprofits funded? How are they supported? We know for like the last 25, 30 years that nonprofits have been in a way defunded, and the funding space has become more challenging. So now that we're in this place where kind of the volcano has erupted, what does the funding landscape look for nonprofits in the next year or two, or just even immediately in the next 6 months, for example? So that's what we're seeing. So what we really want and what ONN is trying to do is to ensure that the government partner with nonprofits along the journey that we're on right now, because it is a challenging time and a lot of nonprofits are really flexible, really innovative, really responsive, even with a dropout in revenues due to say like fundraising, not being able to do that, doing their normal events, offering particular services. And so partnership will be very important to rebuild that social infrastructure. And nonprofits are kind of centrifugal to that. They're like in the center because we're immediately in communities. We are the experts in some cases on the ground. Um, and I think that's really important to think about, and what role you want to play as you engage with the different levels of government you're going to have to engage with. On the flip side, what we've been seeing is that mutual aid networks are really, you know, thriving in a sense, responding to the needs of people in the immediate communities, working to share information, to make sure things are clearly explained, to provide food security services, a whole bunch of things. So we're seeing kind of how the expression is all things are politics kind of local, and we're seeing that like in action right now, and I think that's really fulfilling to see. But I think the question we need to think about, why does it have to be reactive? Why does it always have to be kind of in a crisis setting, a crisis mode, that these things are happening? Can't we facilitate this in a way that responds to kind of the social needs of people in our communities, as well as the needs of the sector in serving people in those communities? So I think a really big thing is like, what is the plan? What is the next step? And how do nonprofits fit in that plan? And where do we need to articulate our voice, and in what ways? I think also it's put into perspective the social determinants of health, in how nonprofits are actually connected to that, right? Nonprofits are connected to housing, to community health services, to childcare, all these social determinants set the stage for well-being in communities, and nonprofits have been both filling the gap, reacting to obviously the lack of support and infrastructure, either through government or through other means, and have been doing this continuously. And now is the time, I think, to really kind of, disrupt the discourses and some of the myths we have about nonprofits, and reconfigure that to really articulate to government as well to each other, working with each other to make sure that in the next few stages of whatever this pandemic situation looks like, that we can work together to push government in the ways that we need. And last thing I will say, grassroots organizations also have been very important in this, in addition to mutual aid networks. What we found is that we've been hearing on the ground that grassroots organizations, for example, didn't get access to some of the funding that the federal government may have distributed, and that's a really big problem. So I think it puts the question out there, like, as nonprofits, some of them can act as, shared platforms to better support some of these grassroots organizations who are doing some of the work on the ground that even some nonprofits can't do all the time. So it's really thinking about who are the actors in the space on the ground: grassroots, activists, organizations, nonprofits as both advocacy and service providers, organizations, and facilitating that in the various networks that you're in, and also figuring out how to push government to continue to work in partnership with the sector and with different actors to be able to, reimagine what the next steps and what the future of the sector and what the social safety net, social infrastructure really needs to look like. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tashini. So just a quick reminder to everybody that we'll be keeping a speakers list as we go. We'll have a few minutes for questions for Tashini, just to fill in some blanks, and then we want to sort of work through specifically in York Region, how do we see moving forward to ensure a stable and successful nonprofit sector playing its full role in building the post-pandemic recovery. But just a quick reminder, if you want to speak, you can raise your hand on the screen. You can go into the participants section by clicking participants at the bottom of your screen. And if you click, there's a clickable button there that says raise hand that I will be able to see, and I'll call on you. And if all else fails, there's a reaction button at the bottom of the screen, and you can just click that, and I will spot the hand going up or the thumb going up, and we'll flag it that way. And there's also the chat, and both Kate and Yvonne and I will all be watching the chat just to make sure we don't miss anybody, because we're not all in the same room, and it's still tricky to make sure that we spot everybody as we go. So let me just start by seeing if there are any folks who have any specific questions for Tashini in terms of clarification, or just to get her to expand on any of the things that she just raised.
So I'll just unmute myself. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, good, thanks. I just always like to check. Hi, Tashini, thanks so much for the presentation. Lovely to see you on this platform today. So I believe I saw that the ONN also did a second survey. Are you able to share? I think it's closed. Are you able to share anything from that? I'm curious, in many of the networks and tables I sit at, we're now starting to talk about lots of the things you mentioned, the what next. And I'd be curious to know if you can share, and I'm going to analyze information, but yeah, to share any information on what findings from that survey, and maybe what you're hearing in terms of what other jurisdictions are doing on that what next piece.
Yeah, so in terms of the survey, I'm in the midst of analyzing the data right now. So I'm deep diving and currently drafting up the report. But I could give you some highlights based on some of the comments I've read through from the sector specifically. So in regards to, say, the supports that were provided by the province and the federal government, so whether it's the wage subsidy or the emergency fund, or some of the kind of, I would say, somewhat piecemeal supports that, say, the province have provided for specific parts of the sector in terms of service agencies for emergency, those that have been selected as emergency organizations. what we're seeing, say, with the wage subsidy is that the wage subsidy doesn't cover contractors, and a lot of nonprofits contract out. So that was a really interesting setting for me. It's not necessarily in the data in terms of the response, the specific data responses, but in the comments, I saw a trend of that there, which I thought was very interesting, and I think something we need to figure out and think about as we go forward. Like, what does work look like? What does the gig economy look like? What does contracting look like in the sector? Um, and I think that's a bigger question even for us at ONN around decent work and what that means in the future of work. So that's one insight I could give. One of the things we found was that it was segmented into thirds. So like there's a third of nonprofits that are operating kind of partially in the sense that their doors are open, but they're following protocol of what's required. Some of them are just mostly virtually online. Some of them, I think, they're closed until further notice. And so what we've noticed is there's a drop off now because there were some that had like closed until further notice and are probably just closed for good. And we may not have captured that data in this particular survey, but we're seeing that obviously some of them, maybe a fifth or so, have closed completely for good at this point. So there's that, the closures and what the impact of that will be. And I think what we're seeing is there's an increase in demand for the nonprofits that are now open, right? Whether virtual or partially open. So what does that increase in demand mean? I mean, what is their capacity? And is their capacity being supported, say, in terms of funding, in terms of how regulations are being implemented, communicated, managed, right? I think that's really important in terms of implementation and practices and how nonprofits are going to manage around these things. Also, expenditure, I think we've seen increase as well in regards to increasing demands, but that's again because nonprofits have pivoted. They're online and virtual. Also, they have requirements that they have to follow because of the pandemic. So, and then I think as I'm writing this right now, I'm thinking about, okay, we're going into stage 3 in Ontario. So what does this all mean for stage 3? How is this going to work for nonprofits that are already facing this kind of burden? So it's very interesting. Some of the patterns are similar to what we saw in the previous survey, and that like the arts sector still has been impacted. We're seeing sports being really, really impacted by this, sports recreation a lot. We did the survey, we did some analysis by language, and we did analysis by subsector. So we have that coming in the data, as well as we did some analysis by region. I haven't had time to go into the regional data quite yet. I've just looked more subsector and some language. But these are the things that we're thinking about as we look at the data, and also previously looking at the other report, and also thinking about the status of the sector when the first budget was released by the provincial government, right? A number of things were cut and then a number of things were rolled back. So there's already uncertainty. Now the uncertainty has become more intensified, and we're seeing it. So what does this all mean in this space, and in how we kind of work with different institutions to address this? So hope that answers your question. If you have any more, I'll try.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that.
No problem.
I just had a quick technical question. You said you were segmenting by region. Is the GTA a region, or is York region?
Yeah, so Toronto specific, we have a region, but we haven't broken down into like, we can't, I think we've decided not to drill down this time on like GTA specific regions, but like Toronto wide in terms of trends. I know the previous survey, we did find some information on specific regions that we did drill down on, but mostly it's regional in terms of like east, west, central, city of Toronto, so capital GTA, and I think north, right? Because that's what we're trying to see, and seeing how regionally organizations have been impacted and what that means for them. So that's how we've done it this time. Because honestly, with the way we approach the survey, again, we could cut the survey up into like how many different segments, from the community served segment that we have to like budget size. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. I think we could go, a colleague of mine said we could go to December with all the information that we have, right? But I think we need to pull out the most important, and the most important right now, I think, is understanding the impact on, like, in terms of services, service demand, and managing that, whether the government response has been adequate and if there needs to be an upgrade or a shift in how government is responding to the sector. And also just figuring out, like, I think, again, work, like how does that work for people, staff, and obviously the different communities in terms of language and what's happening regionally, so the government gets an idea. Because I feel like from my assessment of this provincial government specifically, their regional focus has mostly been kind of rural, suburban, and so having that kind of menu of regions to look at may encourage them to respond in the ways that we need. And if that's even coordinated across regions about particular things that are needed, I think they're more likely to respond to support, say, City of Toronto area, as well as the other regions that are being impacted across the province. So, yeah.
Thank you. Well, we're looking forward to seeing that data roll out, but I think it makes it all the more important that we have these discussions here in York Region to drill down into the patterns that are specific here. And so I just want to take us to a bit of that discussion. And you know, I'm as a perennial optimist, I guess I want to start with some of the good news and explore that a little bit, which is that the pandemic was, you know, an enormous challenge for people, and you know, quite difficult in the lives of lots of folks in the region. But it also demonstrated the capacity of the not-for-profit sector to step up, to coordinate effectively with governments, to deliver in the face of real challenges, and to respond really nimbly. And one of the things I'd like to hear from the group is some of the areas you think that York Region did particularly well in the nonprofit sector in responding to the pandemic. What did we get right? What are some of the systems that worked well? And a lot of you are nonprofit service providers, so this is your chance to you know, crow.
We have one comment in the chat box.
Yeah, I see Janice mentioning that community meals, and Kate, you're here. My sense is that the food security systems really jumped into the breach pretty nicely.
I would agree. I think within the region, we have a handful of emergency food access options, and we've had and we've seen this an interesting kind of network of really grassroots informal organizations emerge, well, and being supported by kind of some of the more established formal organizations that have been operating and existing within the region for a few years, all the way up to a few decades. So yeah, I would agree. I think from a food lens in terms of meals, really supporting getting groceries out to folks. The networks have been there, and it's been, and I think there's been interesting partnerships and connections. I know for ourselves, for example, we've always had the model of we provide the foods, but we don't necessarily get it, like we don't have a distribution model. So it's people come to us. And so I think the pandemic has shown these opportunities for other organizations who specialize in transportation and distribution to jump in and kind of connect people accordingly. So that's been, yeah, that's been really exciting to see from a immediate perspective, but also as in longer term partnerships.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah, Kate, thank you for that. Yeah, so that replicates what we're seeing in the survey around different networks and different partnerships emerging, grassroots to more established organizations. So I know that in some cases, the food security sector, I think some people are projecting that they're going to need more support over the next year or so, given what we're seeing. So I'm wondering what you think the opportunities are, what you think the challenges may be in the next 6 months, as well as how do you think, particularly specific to York Region, how should maybe government be rethinking how it addresses the food insecurity problem, and how can they work with you and organizations that are doing this work in your network?
So I have to so the York Region Food Network, we very much stand by the value and the lens of food insecurities. The root cause of that is inadequate income and inadequate financial means to purchase food. So to me, I've been amazed with what's been happening in the sector around food security. Just how every single organization has been able to mobilize and just respond has been incredible. That said, I always just and even my entire team, we sit back and we just look at the amount of money that we're running around, and so much of the food sector is based on volunteer labor. And we just keep thinking, if some of the federal money and some of the support money just goes directly into people's pockets, it would give people the choice of what they can purchase when they want to purchase it. It takes away, because one of the big issues and concerns and challenges we have is we can't necessarily get culturally appropriate foods out to people. So right now, a lot of people are receiving kind of very generic hampers, which doesn't necessarily speak to their nutritional or their cultural values. So for me, yeah, I would say what I would love to see from that lens is really just, knowing that a lot of people are able to get out to the stores. They do have kind of the physical means to be supporting themselves around food, but it's making sure we get enough money into their pockets to make that happen. So, and I think there's a lot of different approaches to increasing people's income. But for me, that's what I would love to see. I feel like it would alleviate a lot of the burden and the stress from nonprofits. And realistically, when I think of a lot of the emergency food programs, I would say 80 to 90% is volunteer based. So we really are putting a lot of people at risk. And I think there's, more formal channels that we could go through. Not that I want to just say, oh, let's send everyone to the grocery stores, but they have more money to put the appropriate safety in place to make it safer for everybody.
Yeah, and for those who came to last week's sessions, we clustered together food security, income supports, and affordable housing. Because of that important intersection that there's no amount of third sector brilliance that can make up for ongoing grinding poverty. We do have to try and tackle that. We got a lot of stuff in the chat though, and I want to go to some of those folks. Danielle mentioned 3C clusters. Danielle, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, hi. So I think it was United Way together with York Region, and they started those clusters. One was for seniors, one was for food security, and the other one I don't know. But we started to meet on a weekly basis, and out of that, a lot of collaboration started. We kept everybody informed what was going on. We brainstormed regarding new initiatives, and I found it extremely valuable. And I think even after COVID, when this is all done, I think we should just continue doing this.
Yeah, and certainly one of the things that I've been hearing all over the GTA, and especially in the outer suburban regions, is the support that United Way gave to people being nimble and connected was an important part of building the capacity. And Moy, you had some comments about supports for seniors?
Yes, we were funded to deliver culturally appropriate food and groceries to Chinese seniors in the York region. So that went really, really well. All the spots were gone within an hour every week when we open up. So the demand is really huge. And we have rely a lot on volunteer drivers as well. So that I think that's going to continue a little longer because we got a second installment of funding that we applied for. So we're hoping that will continue. But even past COVID, I think with some of the online services, we're finding that we can reach more seniors who do have devices. But one issue is lack of devices. For those who do, in the winter time, I can see this continuing because we tend to lose seniors over the winter months. Because transportation, as you know, in your region is always a challenge.
Belita, you have some comments on that very same topic.
Hi. Yes, I think I commented on being able to reach clients irrespective of geographic areas. Mm-hmm. However, as was previously mentioned, clients without access to laptops, computers, they are still the ones being left behind. I heard about an interesting application that was came about through a hackathon, and it was developed in BC by an organization called Peace Geeks. They have an application, a mobile application, which they've introduced to service those individuals without access to laptops and other sort of computer devices. And they are in the midst of launching in Calgary, I believe, Toronto and Montreal, and the intention is to go national. And I thought that would be a great opportunity for our sector to get involved. I'm not quite sure what the next step is in order to do that, but I thought it was a brilliant idea.
Yeah, that certainly speaks to a critical challenge that's coming, which is, I see also from your notes that there's a bit of a divide. There are folks that have access to technology and they're able to be nimble and respond in this space, and then there's folks that don't, both nonprofits that don't have a lot of access to technology and individuals that don't have a lot of access to technology, and that handicap has just been multiplied. So it's an interesting piece.
Yes, I can expand on that a little bit. As far as our organization, Job Skills, we were able to mobilize staff within a 2-week period because they had enough laptops for staff to take home. And so we didn't have concerns about privacy or, confidentiality sort of concerns regarding clients, because we were able to log on and access our databases. The good thing about the Welcome Center as well, because another agency that we partnered with were not fortunate enough to be able to have that infrastructure in place, we are now supporting them to process client intakes. So that collaboration is still ongoing, despite us being outside of the physical location.
Interesting. And Scott, I have you down next.
Thank you. The generous people in organizations of York Region, since this has kicked in when it comes to Yellow Brick House and our 2 essential services, which are 2 shelters plus our 24/7 crisis support line. It has built partnerships that hopefully are going to be long lasting. And I think that one of the greatest things that we should be proud of as members of the community of York Region has been people stepping up that maybe for years hadn't, or they were in a certain channel. And that comes from food delivery to PPE to resources, because we were not at the top of any of the lists. And through the work of our team, but also the community sharing with each other, it has been very rewarding. And hopefully going forward, it'll stay that way.
And, I have to say, if I've learned anything from this pandemic, it is that people are incredibly resilient and very, very nimble. And there's an awful lot of dedication out there. We've done miraculous things that certainly I, for one, would have thought that about half the things I've seen happen in the last 4 months were impossible to do, no matter how much you wanted to. And I was dead wrong.
I'm with you, and I think that it's continuing as the domestic violence rate continues to go up. The demand keeps going up, and some days I sort of wonder how long until we hit that breaking point, and people just step forward to say, how may we help?
Yeah.
And it's been great.
But I think that's a good segue, and Janice has also flagged the same segue with that there are limits on this. And you can do so many things off the side of your desk, and apparently you can do a lot off the side of your desk, but it's probably not infinite. And we do see seniors who are disconnected and isolated, not being able to connect into some of these programs, and we see You, Scott, approaching the limit even of the generosity that surged forward in this process. So I want to ask people a little bit about where they see the challenges coming. What do they see as the big risks as we go forward in this context for their organizations and for the folks that they serve? Danielle, I think you get to start. I think that you're thinking the thought that's on everybody's mind.
Okay. Yeah, so when I speak for Roots, I don't think we are in financial trouble this year. I mean, we have the loan where there is the $10,000 is forgivable. Then we have the wage subsidy that is now extended till the end of December. We have some concerned citizens that are donating. So for this year, again, there is no issue. But I'm really worried about next year because there won't be any funds. Nothing from Trillium. I don't think anything from the United Way. The town, I think all the municipalities will run a deficit. I mean, it will be. I think the hit will come for the nonprofits in 2021.
And Scott, you have a little to add to that?
I think one of our concerns is the corporate partners. We have such a large amount of our funding for our programs is not generated by either municipality, the region, the province. It's generated through corporate sponsorships and through individual giving. And that's a concern because everyone is being impacted at different levels. And I don't think we know what that impact is yet. I think we're still in a little bit of a bubble zone. And come January, if there happens to be a second wave and this hits again and we go into a total shutdown, what does 2021 look like? Danielle, I think you're right. We've got to be prepared.
And I'm hearing that from lots of folks it's not just where you are, but not knowing where you're going to be. Not just you as organizations, but also your donors who don't know where they're going to be. And so they have to be thinking about how far can they stretch and how far can't they stretch. And, charitable organizations and charitable foundations trying to figure out what their fundraising profile looks over the next couple of years as we go forward. So certainly that's a challenge. Are there other things that people look at and think, here's something either that's good that we could build on or a challenge that we've been tussling with for the last little while. And we need the world to be slightly different if we're going to be able to move forward in a productive way.
Donna, just building on the funding discussion, I know that one of the things that came out of the first discussion we had, and certainly lots of groups that I've been talking with, is that just the way funding came directly and swiftly for the needs that were identified on the ground. And actually the funders completely relied on those on the ground to say this is what's required. And that's a funding model we haven't seen for about 30 years. I think it was a lot more, funding decisions were informed a lot more by community-based organizations who are directly involved with their clients. And now we have a very different model. So I wonder, I know everyone's concerned about where the money's going to come from, but I think in reimagining, we still have to be quite articulate and straightforward and honest about what would be the ultimate ways of doing things differently. And I think we're seeing that contract work and unstable, precarious funding in this sector in particular just limits us so much. So I think being smart about what are those things that can be done more directly in terms of, as Kate and Tashini have talked about, money that people need to do what they need to do, that's a direct transfer. Funding that we need to do to provide, to keep programs and services and people directly involved with other people, that's where I think we have to really say, yeah, we can all tighten our belts, we can merge, we can do all kinds of things, but it isn't going to create or sustain a sector that's going to be able to face the next pandemic or even just be able to continue with the increased need. So I think funding is critical to this.
And I'm seeing, that the realization that there's been a capacity to step up in a lot of ways and fill a lot of gaps, but probably not all of them. And the folks who we're not filling the gaps for are facing some big challenges now, and we'll probably need to grow what we're doing. And Janice, you have some comments about that. Do you want to jump on?
Hi, how are you?
Good.
As well, one of the comments that I made about the organizations, I don't know that's where you're going with, is that are being more selective of who's actually going to get that particular, like say that grocery card. It's not going to be given out to everybody. I understand that it probably can't be given out to everybody, but perhaps there is a way for that could actually happen. I guess through the government, helping these organizations, but more or less when we talk about corporations, what I see is they get a lot of tax breaks, and perhaps if they didn't get so much of that, let's just say corporations save billions of dollars in tax cuts in a year. So perhaps we could do that a little bit differently. One idea that I've just put out there is every business has to put something towards charities of some sort. So perhaps we can reorganize how that actually looks. But the major thing for me is that the corporations, businesses that save on all that tax, that's a problem. And that could be rectified somehow, negotiated some way.
So certainly sources of revenue are going to be a big question as we move forward. One of the things that got mentioned earlier, and I'd just like to drill down into it a little bit more, is about the collaboration. And people talk not just about the coordination, like the cluster tables, but also agencies working together to help each other cover gaps, and agencies even supporting grassroots organizations to be able to step in. What are you going to need to be able to keep that practice going? Because we're having this conversation about how tough funding is going to be, and if that's the case, then we're going to need to continue to be able to find ways to fill gaps. What organizations on this call need to be able to stay in a collaborative mode, coordinating their work and reaching out to partners to help them along? Lynn.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, good. I'm wondering if one of the other ways that we can collaborate and get funding is to actually go to major corporations and provide some sort of proposal to them to say we are like Loblaws, for instance, right? And say we are an a group of organizations, and these are the kind of things that we need, and look to corporate funding in addition to government funding.
I see Moy, you have thoughts on that as well.
Yes, I was thinking for big corporations that are making a profit, can they be legislated or encouraged to make either cash contributions or in-kind contributions? I think supermarkets is one example. They can make donations of food, and other corporations can donate their skills and other things. So if we can sort of make it something like a social contract, making that part of their responsibility as corporations to society, because we know they have good accountants to allow them not to pay any taxes. But if we make this part of their, make it a requirement for them to continue to be good corporate citizens, maybe a carrot is better than a stick. I don't know. I just thought there's a lot of opportunity for doing that. I think through this pandemic, and also with the Syrian refugee crisis, it also happened. many people were donating money. Some of them were actually giving it to the government, or they want to donate goods. So maybe we can harvest that kind of goodwill from corporations so that they can be more involved in supporting the community.
Yeah, and that kind of engagement, I think, is one of those things that we are going to need to figure out, especially if you know, we're confronting, as Scott was saying earlier, some stresses on corporate giving. I know that on the list of folks who did well the last little while are digital service corporations, and this federal government ran on a promise of a digital service corporation tax. So we'll see if that might be a help to this sort of work. But Tashini, I have you next.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing in the discussion, there's a lot of kind of systems challenges that are conflicting. So we have the way the tax revenue system is structured, and in some way biased for corporations to continue to accumulate wealth in some way and either hoard it and not redistribute it in the ways that it needs to, whether that be through wages, because we could talk about obviously wage theft, which is an occurrence and which we're seeing. So I think fundamentally there are some things where we have to kind of lift all boats. There are some standards that government itself needs to set in terms of what it wants. And so the question, I think, for us is like, what are the standards we as a nonprofit sector want to set, and what are the standards the government is not setting right now in terms of its particular actions? In addition to that, what is the private sector not doing? And I think there's also, I think we have to be careful around private sector in the sense of small to medium enterprises and larger, bigger corporations and foreign corporation and entities, as well as say banks and whatnot. Yes, they provide us with some really good funding to help support our initiatives and our innovation, but what do we want them to actually fund? What are the things we need them to, and what should the government be funding, right? Like, I think those are some specific things to think about on a systems level. And I think a good example of this is I think the federal government announced some stuff around infrastructure and ready to build shovel-ready projects. So if in York Region, for example, there are some shovel-ready projects, is there a community benefits activity happening? Is there social procurement happening? How are nonprofits in this ecosystem working with those entities? So if there's construction organizations and corporations, how are they either creating space for nonprofits to deliver their services, offering in-kind space, again, for you to be able to support the communities that you're serving. So I think there are some micro things that need to be addressed, and then there's some meso and then macro things, more systemic, that obviously will take a lot of solidarity movement in different spaces and in different ways as we move forward. But in those meso spaces and those micro spaces, if those ideas come and nonprofits can bolster, particularly in York Region, bolster each other and support each other in the ways that those levers need to be kind of turned and twisted, I think a lot of things could be reimagined and rethought of and you know, differently, right? But again, like you said, there are still many challenges, and so what happens in the next 6 months, right? And that's really the most challenging part, is the uncertainty, and how, again, the uncertainty has just magnified to 100 at this point. And so, but I think the sector itself is so innovative and so flexible, but that's good, but we need to push back some in the ways that we need, obviously. So.
Yeah, and I certainly hear that. There is the desire for us to find new partnerships and new solutions and do more things in connectivity, but there's also the need for some certainty and stability, and finding ways to you know, have a real solid backstop. I think is also a significant issue and challenge for all of us. Well, and we're running close to the end of our time, and I did want to get a few more people into the conversation, and so I'm going to do a bit of a go around. And what I'd love to hear from everybody, and we're just going to go right through all the screens, and I'll call on people. But what are the one or two things that your organization or the folks that you work with need the most to be able to support nonprofit contribution to getting us through the rest of this pandemic and the next wave, and be resilient enough for the crisis after that? So I'm going to start with Yvonne, and because she's at the top of my screen.
Oh, okay. I was just going to write in the chat. I mean, I don't think we want to give up on holding our governments accountable to hold our corporations accountable. Coming out of the world wars, our social contract very much heavily relied on being able to tax according to ability to pay. And so our corporate tax rates are very low now, and there's a lot of really good work being done by groups like CCPA, Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, showing that even a modest increase in corporate tax would allow us to reinvest and really invest in public services and the not-for-profit sector. So I think we have a pretty good system of charitable donations. People in Canada who donate get the best tax benefits of any country in the world. I would more or less focus on having them pay taxes and increase in taxes and taxes that they aren't paying at all.
I've got Lynn next.
Hmm.
Oh, Lynn, you just muted yourself.
No, I'm all about collaborating all the time. So I just think that when you approach the government that you need to have a plan, and there's no point, like, you have to, everybody has to pull together. Everybody has to know exactly what we want in order to get an ask, because we're billions of dollars in debt. So if we're asking for more money, or we're asking to reallocate money, we need to have all our ducks in a row, and we need to know, well, this money could come from this pool and could be, better used this way. So I think it's a long-term project, but we need to actually decide on maybe 1 or 2 goals that would help in York Region, and then maybe divide out and go into different task force. But we just need to be very prepared, that's all.
Kate.
I would say for me, so York Region Food Network is a very precariously funded organization. And at the start of COVID, what I found was really helpful from funders, and it allowed us to really pivot quickly, was just the idea of flexible funding, of saying, you know what, you get to keep your funding. If you need to change it, and just let us know how that's being adapted. And I'm very conscious that we want to make sure funds are accountable, everything's transparent, but just the opportunity for flexible funding to us has made all the difference during this, this crisis.
Fantastic. I'm going to go to Erin next. Go ahead, Erin.
You're a bit low, Erin.
Erin, I can't hear you, I'm afraid. Okay, we're going to come back to Erin. I'm going to go to Geraldine.
All right.
There we go.
Yeah, I just agree with Lynn around the collaboration. I think that one of the things that really was really stood out through this whole COVID, for me anyway, was the fact that when non-for-profits worked together and they shared their resources, they were able to do so much more. And I think that going forward, for me, that would be something to really look at. Maybe we need a few more bigger non-for-profits as opposed to a lot of smaller non-for-profits. Because the government, we're going to be in a big deficit once we come out of this, and so it's going to be hard to get more money when they're already going to, they're going to be looking at streamlining anyway now to get over it. So I just think collaboration is the key.
Great. And I've got Gurneet next.
Yeah, for myself, just being a summer student, just thinking about how funds can be reallocated to really get youth involved in the community, because there are groups, but at the same time, more can be done. And if we're not being involved, it just kind of, leaves a gap in who's the next generation of leadership.
Fantastic. Jeff.
Yeah, so in the healthcare sector, CHATS, my organization serving seniors, we're pre-COVID entering into the new health regime with Ontario Health, and us being funded predominantly by the provincial government, we're good for now, which is great, but we don't have clarity on the future. So we're looking for that clarity. we were before. We're looking for more so now. We do get some funds from grantors, some from donors, but predominantly provincial government through Ontario Health. So that newness has presented uneasiness and discomfort just knowing the change is coming. And then with the COVID change, we don't know what that means, and it's just delayed things. So it's prolongating the discomfort with change management.
Great. I have Carol next.
Hi. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing about partnerships and working together and doing what you do best. So, the groups that are joining together to help each other out is exactly what we need to be doing. Why reinvent the wheel? We need to be working together.
Fantastic. Surjeet.
Hi. A thought came to my mind was that when we are asking for donations or contributions for anybody, it could be like a barter system that we provide a return in terms of time or labor. So it's like a two-way street. You give us something and we give something to you in return, going back to the older days of bartering services, and that way, benefiting both the parties.
Okay. Ramonia.
I think for me, I'm mostly just looking at how we can reduce the precarious work for our employees and how we tie that back into funding.
Right.
We've been doing a lot of work looking at it from the lens of a decent work, and we're always saying, hey, we can't increase your wage or we can't do this because we just don't have the funding. And so maybe just flip it, looking at funding in a different way where it allows your employee to, be paid a fair wage where they get a cost of living, or just in essence reducing the precarious work that comes with being in the healthcare sector, and broadly the non-for-profit, right? That's something I'm looking at it, and most likely because I'm from the HR side. Mm-hmm. And so how does donations or funding, how we can funnel that back into supporting employees?
And that's something we haven't talked a whole lot about, and I do think it's so incredibly important, is in normal times, the not-for-profit sector is about 8% of the economy. And during the COVID crisis, it is several times that. It's been one of the most stable components of the economy right now because, well, manufacturing and all kinds of other things shut down. The not-for-profit sector, went into overdrive. And if the not-for-profit sector is going to struggle during the recovery, then that's an important part of the economy that is struggling when we need everything firing on all cylinders. I think I've got everybody who hasn't had a chance to speak yet. No, I'm sorry, Patricia, you haven't spoken
yet. Some way to make the case absolutely insist that there be core funding. So you can keep the lights on, you can heat the place, so people have some sense that they're not going to have to stop buying paper, instead of associating everything with your funding with a project. And on that note, that they become less onerous on the amount of paperwork that has to be done afterwards on a project to show how wonderful it was. It takes too much time, especially when your core funding is very limited, and it's the staff right there all the time that often have to do an awful lot of the work after they get the material from people on the project.
Absolutely, and like Jeff and Scott said, predictability is going to matter, so it would be good to have that. And I have one person on the phone who's unidentified, but that one person on the phone just disappeared. So we're just a tiny bit over time, so I'm just going to throw the floor open to anybody else who has one thing that they want to say is the most important thing, but I wanted to make sure that everybody else who hadn't spoken yet got in. Okay, I got Scott and then Lynn.
Quick thing is, if you have a facility and you're looking to re-engage with renovations for social distancing and all of those things, we're looking for some help with, if anybody has a contact with IPAC, at any of the hospitals. And because it's now becoming that they are somebody who needs to be involved if you're getting funding. So just throwing it out there, it came out of the blue on us. So if anybody has anybody at MSH or along those lines that can put us into contact with somebody who's part of IPAC, we greatly appreciate it. And you can reach out to me at Yellow Brick House.
Fantastic. And Scott, maybe you want to put your email in the chat box so that people can find you more readily?
Type in.
Perfect. And I got Lynn, and then I'm going to bring us towards the action part of our agenda before we wrap up in a couple of minutes.
Hi. So I was just thinking that I really like the idea of the core funding. And we've been talking about, you know, sort of the universal income and the basic income guarantee. And I'm wondering whether or not that might be something that we could all do, where we could all, as corporations, as not-for-profits, actually put down what our core funding is on a monthly basis, right? And then that could be part of a basic income for the not-for-profits, so that we, you know, at least we'd have a benchmark and we would be covered as far as our heating, our lighting, our paper, or whatever. So I just thought it's kind of a good extension from, you know, individuals. It should also go to not-for-profits.
All right. Those are great ideas, and we've been recording, and Kate's been taking furious notes, and so have I, and probably Yvonne as well. So as we look at all of this, and this, I think, terrific pool of very good ideas about collaboration, about establishing greater stability, about the kinds of networks that we can build, but also about getting access to the funding that ensures that we can continue to do that. The next step in this process is pulling those ideas together and bringing them forward to policymakers in York Region to make sure that they hear what the community is talking about and can respond effectively to it. So we'll pull those notes together and we'll make sure that we get them out to everybody. If you're interested in participating in the process of bringing this forward to policymakers, I'm just going to give you the Social Planning Council's email address. If you just want to pop something in the chat or email Yvonne and put your hand up to be part of that process. Because if we're going to turn these good ideas into real solutions, we're going to have to talk to some people who have their hands on the levers of decision making, and that's the next step for this work. With that, I think I better wrap us up because we're a few minutes over time, but I want to thank everybody. It's been a great crowd, lots of terrific ideas. I have barely been able to keep up with all the notes. And I'm looking forward to working with you to turn those ideas into real public policy. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone. I hope to see lots of you on tomorrow's Call for Decent Work. Have a good night.
Fantastic. And thanks especially to Shini Harrison and to the Ontario Nonprofit Network for all the great work that they do and that she does.
Thank you all. We're listening, so keep sharing.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm gonna go take a shower. Goodbye. See you guys in a week. So what's the point of saying goodbye if you're coming back in a week?
Okay, we're good.
Yep.
I had lots of dog activity on this end, which was very interesting.
I noticed you were muting and hiding and doing all
And then at one point I didn't take my video off and I was like, kind of like this. I don't know who saw
Oh, I
that,
missed
but
that.
there was the
probably looking
dogs at the
other
door
things.
going back and forth. And I'm like, get out of here, you guys. Anyway, okay. I do have to run because my son's leaving and
Yep. No,
that's what the dog.
I have a 410 in the nonstop back-to-back Zoom land.
But yeah, do you want me to facilitate tomorrow? Kate, do you want to facilitate? What do we want to do? I should be better by tomorrow. Yeah?
Yeah, I can you know what, can I just look at my schedule and see if I have time to, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Let's
Okay.
talk about it
I'll
tomorrow.
confirm.
Okay. Sounds
Okay.
good.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. That's 4 out of 5 gone very, very nicely. So we got one
Yeah,
more to
not
go.
bad. One more to go.
Then we got to put together a set of asks, and I think we might want to correlate with the Reimagining Ontario group that's province-wide, because they're they're on a very similar page, and there is strength in numbers. So,
Okay.
so I'm going to send you guys the.
Okay, good.
They just met today. They finished finally their ask, codifying their ask. I'm going to send it to you just so you can see where they are, and
That'd be good.
there's a good matchup there.
Awesome.
That
Okay,
sounds
thanks,
great.
Sean. Have a good night, guys.
And I will email you guys the video link.
Good.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye. Have a good night.
You too.